As far as I know, POCO have always put their focus on their flagship F-series lineup. But in the past couple of years, they've been dedicating more and more of their energy into their mid-range fleet of devices. Today I have with me what I like to classify as an upper mid-range smartphone, the all-new POCO X4 GT, which not only improves over its predecessor, but closes the gap between mid-range and flagship smartphones. We're talking a 5nm run MediaTek Dimensity 8100 chipset that not only leaves the Snapdragon 870 in the dust, but even rivals against last year's flagship Snapdragon AAA chipset. It houses a 144Hz display, 64 megapixel triple camera setup, massive 5080 mAh battery, and very fast 67 watt wired charging. It comes with loads of goodies in the box and starts at just €379. I am Tech Nick, and this is my review of the POCO X4 GT. The POCO X4 GT comes in 3 colors. You can pick it up in a blue, a silver, or the color version that I have with me here today, known simply as black. It looks pretty classy and shimmers a little bit in the light. It is actually a bit of a matte finish, though do bear in mind this is a plastic finish. However, it does very much look like anti-glare glass. And inside this stunner sits a 5080 mAh battery and pretty darn fast 67 watt wired charging. A MediaTek Dimensity 8100 chipset with an integrated MIUI G10MC6 GPU. It also packs in LPDDR5 RAM, UFS 3.1 storage, a new liquid cool 2.0 cooling system, as well as Wi-Fi 6, 5G, Bluetooth 5.3, and NFC. The front is made of Gorilla Glass 5, however, the back and the sides are unfortunately plastic, and this guy comes in at just 8.87mm thick and is 200 grams in weight. The back camera sensor looks pretty neat, and if you ask me, a triple camera setup is more than decent on a mid-range phone such as this. We do have an 8 megapixel ultra-wide sensor, 64 megapixel main, and 2 megapixel macro sensor. Unfortunately, no telephoto this time around. The 8 megapixel ultra-wide comes out alright. 64 megapixel main looks fantastic. Binning it down to 16 looks even better thanks to 4:1 pixel binning and AI. We do have 2x digital zoom using the 64 megapixel main. We can bin it down to 16 megapixel. Once again, a lot more depth and color accuracy. 5x digital over here, as well as 10x digital zoom, that being the max zoom. Taking a close-up snap, we can use that 2 megapixel macro sensor, which does an okay job, though I have seen better. And when taking a portrait photo of myself here, it actually does a pretty decent job thanks to almost perfect edge detection. There is no portrait or cinematic video recording option, though we do have 4K 30fps video. Unfortunately, no 4K 60fps option. It does a more than decent job in terms of clarity. It actually pops in color as well, but the stabilization just is not there because there is a pretty hefty lack of OIS and EIS. You can even see it over here when recording at 1080p, though 1080p can go up to 60 FPS, which is great, whereas 4K is limited to 30 FPS. And taking a close-up video of my dog over here does a pretty good job in terms of detail. 1080p 30 FPS is the cap when it comes to ultra-wide. No 4K for ultra-wide, no 60 FPS for ultra-wide, though it doesn't look terrible. I have seen better, but you've got to remember the price point of this phone is pretty darn great for the results that it's outputting over here. The cameras do a more than decent job if you ask me, and they have improved the main sensor, so that's always a bonus. And on the right side of the device, we have a power button mixed up with a fingerprint sensor, above that a non-split volume rocker, and at the bottom a dual SIM 5G standby tray. Unfortunately, no expandable storage, though there is a water resistant seal. We have a USB 2.0 Type-C port alongside that, and alongside that, the first dual stereo speaker, one at the bottom, one at the top, both paired with Dolby Atmos. And this time around, we see the headphone jack return. Thank goodness for that, as well as an IR blaster. At the top of the screen, we do have a punch hole selfie camera, which comes in at 16 megapixels, and the regular photos look decent. The portrait background looks even better thanks to great edge detection. But what about the video and microphone quality?
What's up guys, Technic here.
from sunny Johannesburg, South Africa, recording a selfie video on the brand new POCO X4 GT. It can record selfie video at 1080p 60 FPS, which is fantastic. It looks great if you ask me. What do you guys think of the video and audio quality of the brand new POCO X4 GT? The selfie camera on the device does a more than decent job at this price point and powering on the phone. Getting to the black screen when the screen is off, you'll notice that there is no always on display, and that is because this lacks an AMOLED panel, which is okay. We'll get to that in a second. We do have that side mounted fingerprint sensor, which is nice and snappy and does a relatively good job. It's up to you on whether you prefer it on the side. Once again, not underneath the screen because there is no AMOLED panel here. And we do have 2D face unlock, which does the job as you would expect. And getting back to what I was talking about most over there, that being the display, it is an LCD panel, but it is probably the best LCD panel I have ever used. It is a 6.6 inch IPS LCD 20.5 by 9 flat dot display. That aspect ratio makes it a bit thinner and longer than I would have liked. It does have a Full HD Plus resolution, DCI-P3 color gamut rating, HDR10 support, as well as Dolby Vision, and comes in at a more than decent 650 nits of peak brightness, which is actually above par in terms of LCD panel brightness levels on smartphones. It has a 144Hz refresh rate, which is actually a step above its predecessor, and comes in at 270Hz touch sampling rate, but do bear in mind that 270Hz touch sampling rate is only used when you are enabling the 90Hz or 60Hz option on your device. The phone is running MIUI 13, which is skinned over Android 12. It is more optimized than recent MIUI versions, and it actually makes the phone a little bit more efficient, and the 5nm chipset makes it even more efficient. In terms of software, we are kitted with full Google services out of the box, that being Google Discover on the left-hand side, as well as Google Assistant, the Play Store, so on and so forth. The notification drawer is nice and neat, as well as the control center at the top where you can switch between it and your notifications. We do have 8 gigs of LPDDR5 RAM, and yes, you can extend that further by an additional 3 using RAM extension, and while that brings us to a total of 11 gigs of RAM, the additional 3 gigs utilizes UFS 3.1 storage and not the LPDDR5 RAM modules. Of course, at the helm, we do have the 5nm run MediaTek Dimensity 8100 octa-core CPU, which has 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. And when hopping into the battery settings within the settings option, we do have a performance mode option, and when pairing that alongside the chipset, the cooling system, and a whole lot more, we got an AnTuTu score of 830,601 points, which puts it above the Snapdragon 888 and 870. We got a score of 925 single core and 3,581 multi-core on Geekbench version 5, and while the single core was lower than the 870 and 888, the multi-core was higher than even the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset. And when it comes to 3D Mark Wildlife, we got a score of 5,854 points with an average FPS of 35.1, which once again leaves the Snapdragon 888 and 870 in the dust, though it is still quite a way behind the flagship chipsets of 2022. Though this device is more about just benchmarks, that chipset can do more things such as play games and, at no doubt, 144Hz. And in order to test the FPS, we're going to be enabling the FPS counter within the developer options, which I've only seen on Xiaomi and POCO phones. And opening up Game Turbo / Game Space over here, we are welcomed to a bit of a screen overlay when in a game. You can pull in from the tab on the top left corner, and you can open any app on your device into a mini window. You can close it up, and you can tweak a bunch of different settings on this screen overlay with the flick of your finger at the top left corner. Moving on to our first game here, that being Genshin Impact. Highest possible graphics settings, max FPS, we were getting an average FPS of 42. Now, I'm comparing it to the flagship Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset that I've personally tested on my channel. That gets an average of 44. This is a chipset that is half the price of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, and it's almost matching it in terms of average FPS, and it actually got a higher min of 34, but a lower max of 47 FPS, which is still not too bad. Moving on to Real Racing 3 over here, a game that has an unlimited frames per second cap. We got an average of 137 frames per second, which is absolutely phenomenal. We usually get about 145 on a 144 Hz smartphone running a Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset, so it's fantastic to see that this little guy is keeping up with the top dogs. And moving on to our final game over here, that being Bullet Force, making sure that we are set to ultra graphics and max FPS. It does have an unlimited frame cap as well, and the POCO X4 GT was getting an average frame rate of 144 FPS, so it's actually matching the highest possible frame rate it can get on its display on an average when playing Bullet Force at 144 Hz and 144 frames per second. But what about those dual stereo speakers? Let's go ahead and give them a listen. The POCO X4 GT takes mid-range smartphones to the next level, thanks to its sleek design that boasts a matte-like finish and dedicates part of its backplate to an elegant camera module which houses an improved 64 megapixel main camera that takes superb photos and videos. However, it sits alongside a subpar ultra-wide sensor and lackluster macro camera. All three sensors do their jobs adequately, and while the main camera can shoot 4K video, it lacks decent stabilization and can only perform at 60 frames per second when shooting 1080p video. Not to mention, the ultra-wide camera is limited to 1080p 30fps video. The selfie camera does do a decent job too in terms of photography, and while it can shoot 1080p 60fps selfie video recording, it unfortunately lacks a 4K selfie video. The physical fingerprint reader on its side is very responsive and extremely fast, but there's no in-display fingerprint sensor here due to the lack of an AMOLED display. That being said, this is one of the best LCD panels I have ever tested on a smartphone, thanks to great color accuracy, high brightness levels, and buttery smooth 144Hz refresh rates. MIUI 13 has been pretty well optimized for day-to-day usage, and its large 5080 mAh battery should last you all day. If it doesn't, there's always the extremely fast 67 watt wired charging, and yes, the 67 watt block comes bundled in the box. All that said, the star of the show is no doubt the efficient yet high performing MediaTek Dimensity 8100 chipset, which outperforms the Snapdragon 870 and even holds its own when comparing to last year's flagship Snapdragon 888 chipset in terms of benchmarks and gaming. Speaking of gaming, that 144Hz display and Dimensity 8100 chipset are kept cool thanks to the new Liquid Cool 2.0 cooling system. And if that's not enough to aid your gaming needs, there's always the stereo speakers to punch things up to the next level. While there are some compromises such as the lack of an AMOLED display, the POCO X4 GT more than makes up for it in terms of bang for buck due to a very low starting price, making me more than happy to recommend the POCO X4 GT as one of the best upper mid-range smartphones that 2022 has to offer. I hope that you all enjoyed watching this video as much as I did making it. This is TechNick, and I'll catch you in the next one.